Well, you can't talk about drought at the moment without talking about this. Farm industries across the Murray-Darling Basin are on their knees at the moment, with some areas expected to lose a third of their dairy farmers this year alone. It's been revealed that last year, the Murray-Darling Basin lost nearly 2 Sydney harbours worth of water. It is a national scandal, with fingers pointing, of course, to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. What a bunch of keystone operators they are. But I digress. Wheat and dairy farmers along the Upper Murray claim the authority deprived them of their entire water entitlement. I spoke to David McKenzie, who's part of the Murray-Darling Independent Panel charged with recommending to government how to fix this mess. I spoke with him earlier today. Now, you have a huge amount of experience both in boards and forums related to water resources, so you're a good man to have doing this work. How dysfunctional is the Murray-Darling system from what you've already gleaned?
Look, it's such a multifaceted question, I think, Chris. There's probably elements of the plan that are working well, but I think most of the plan, the outcomes are not very discernible to the communities that it's impacting on. And this is probably the key mismatch. People in regional communities feel that this reform is being done to them. It's not being done with them, and they certainly don't feel that it's being done for them. That's what's coming through in our research and our road trip so far.
Let me guess that the emotion is fairly high because the problems associated with the Murray-Darling Basin have been compounded by this horrible, terrible drought.
Absolutely. And look, the drought is all pervading. We've heard some really moving and compelling stories of hardship and to be frank, trauma in some basin communities out over the last month. People have been very brave, I think, in coming forward and telling us exactly how they're going. And it's quite confronting to hear it. Even though I work and live and have done for decades in an irrigation-dependent community, I've been quite shocked, and my fellow panel members have been pretty shocked by what's come forward when people have had the chance to tell us where they're at. And this is not just on farm. Just like the drought goes past the farm gate and into the towns and communities, the impact of water reform is playing a role as well. It's hard to disentangle those two things, but the strong community feedback has been that they sense that water reform in these communities is exacerbating the impact of the drought.
Yeah, without a doubt. So when you've got farmers screaming the house down or the property down, and then you've got a drought on, and then farmers run out of water, literally can't get to an allocation, and yet downstream you've got wetlands which are far too wet, something is dysfunctional here.
That's come through loud and clear as well. I think people, particularly and through your program, people in metropolitan city areas really need to understand, I think, that regional people and farmers care deeply about their environment. They really see themselves as environmental stewards. And one of the things that has come through in a lot of our consultations is real anger and frustration about local environmental damage as a result of the reform. They just see that as being really quite perverse. And what was called out last night in terms of damage around the Barmah Choke, those sort of stories are played out in different parts through the community as well. They're suffering a lot of transition pain as water has been taken out of the consumptive pool for productive use. I think everyone, to a greater or lesser extent, Chris, accepts that there was needed to be some rebalance toward the environment because water was being over-extracted. But now they're not seeing any local wins. They're in fact seeing environmental damage. And as you say, their water that they used to own is now going past them to downstream users and to the environment. And they find it really hard to join the dots. And when they're doing it particularly hard at the moment, after several seasons of pretty tough low rainfall conditions, it's playing a major role, I think, in terms of the mental state of a lot of these regional communities. They're feeling very low. They don't have much confidence in the future in terms of their ability to rebound after the drought breaks because of the background of the water and reform in the background still running. So that's the sort of feedback that the communities really want us to play into the Minister's office.
You mentioned about rebalancing the fight for water between environment and a farm and families and towns, etc. The water reform, seriously, if you talk to farmers, the water reform has clearly overbalanced and not in favour of human beings. Surely if you're going to get it wrong, you should get it wrong in favour of human beings.
I don't think that's a discussion we've had as a country, Chris. I think it's a really interesting point of view. And I don't think regional communities and basin communities really feel as though they've had much say in this.
I know they're saying, hey, we needed a bigger say, but there were open meetings of farmers, plenty of them in country areas leading up to this water reform.
Yes, there were. There were some people that could see where a possible outcome was years ago. You're absolutely right, Chris, and there are certain communities that were very, very vocal about what they thought the worst impacts of this reform could be. Unfortunately, a lot of that has been played out. But just the water reform is more than just recovering water for the environment. This goes back to the broader suite of reforms, unbundling water from land, which has really caused rapid changes to economies out there and the communities that depend on irrigation in those areas. Whether it's dairy in northern Victoria or rice in the Riverina or even cotton now in northern New South Wales and Queensland, water reform is letting water move around really rapidly, and communities and businesses just can't cope with the rate of change that this whole suite of reforms has brought about, coupled with losing 20 to 30% of their water to the environment, as you say. Whether that's overbalanced or rebalanced, I suppose it's a matter for the experts. But those things coming together with the drought at the same time, there are some massive drivers of change there that communities are really struggling to deal with.
Clarify one aspect of the water reforms, which I think need reform. Clarify this for me. Are we really allowing farmers who don't necessarily farm but have water rights and allocations to store that allocation, which increases the price of water and puts more money in their pocket? Are we allowing a system to operate in that fashion?
Yes, I think you're talking about carryover there, Chris,
yeah.
And that is a feature of water markets that have established. And I think there are farmers out there that will say that's important. That's part of their insurance. Instead of having to use their water every season on their dairy farm or on their rice crop, for argument's sake, they can carry some over to next year to start their crop off or to get their pastures going for the next season. That's an important part of the insurance for them. There's a lot of tension in the market now about sort of non-water users, if you like, people who don't own land and apply for productive purposes to land, having access to the same mechanism. And that's one of the nubs of the controversy at the moment.
Is that something that you would be looking at, possibly recommending weeding out of the system?
What we've been asked to do by the Minister is report to him on the impacts of these policy settings. He has the ACCC at the moment looking at water markets, and the Victorian and New South Wales government have also commissioned work on water market transparency. So they're looking into multiple aspects of this. What we're trying to do, I think, or what he's asked us to do, is bring the human element to this. What sort of impact is this having on farms, on farmers, on commodity sectors and on communities? And maybe bringing those things together to have a bit of a policy rethink at a higher level.
So can you shed some light at this early stage on what you might recommend on some of the things that you think can happen quickly and therefore can change water allocation to benefit those without water?
We've just finished our round of consultation through the road trip. So we've been from the top of New South Wales and southern Queensland right down to the Murray Mouth. We're actually coming back to Canberra this week for a couple of days just to consider all that aggregated feedback. So I do think it's a bit early for us to call out things that can happen in the short term. I fear that there's no silver bullet that's going to turn things around really quickly for this season. And then the real fear is, what does next season look like when people are already on their knees? There is a store of environmental water, as people know, in the dams, and that's one of the things that people are pointing at and saying, well, look, critical human needs. We have towns in northern New South Wales in particular that look at running out of water for critical human needs. But what about the role of environment, of agriculture, in supporting these communities to stay in the business, or stay in the game until things turn around a little bit? So that's the sort of stuff that people have been talking to us about. We need to think through the policy implications of that and how we might frame something around potential triggers for reuse of water that's allocated for different reasons, for different purposes. That would require all of the state water ministers and the federal water ministers to be in full agreement to change any of those sort of settings. But that's the sort of stuff that people are talking to us about, and hope that we'll be able to offer some advice on.
You're mentioning the word storage. I wonder whether, long ago, we should have built, along with the water reform, a program of building more dams along this catchment area.
I'm in northern Victoria, Chris, and I know that the opportunities in Victoria for more dams are quite limited, because really every megalitre is allocated. It's all owned by someone. So if you build a bigger dam in Victoria, you hold it up for use by people there, and that impacts on downstream users' allocation and their reliability for their water. I think there are opportunities elsewhere through the basin that are being explored pretty rapidly now. I think there probably is a bit of lost ground to be made up in exploring and making sure that we've used all the opportunities we can to capture flows when they're there. But that's not going to be the silver bullet right across the basin. It depends on the geography, depends on the water allocation and entitlement framework. And in Victoria, basically, as I say, the jurisdiction I know best, pretty well every megalitre is owned by somebody. So if you capture it somewhere else to allow someone to use it, it's going to impact on everyone else in the system. It's hard to sort of break out of those ripple impacts and unforeseen third-party impacts. It's a very complex operating environment. I think if there were any easy answers, Chris, people would have implemented them long ago.
Yeah. But
there seems to be policy on top of policy, on top of, all sorts of things, building up regulations and rules to the point where it's a hideously complex operating environment for irrigators, and it's really hard to unwind or to unscramble the omelette. But it's clear that there are multiple elements of the reform that I think are driving unforeseen consequences and perverse outcomes in some circumstances, social, economic and environmental. And let's, to be balanced, we recognise that areas are having wins as well. The reform has suited some regions, some commodity sectors and some communities.
Yeah.
So overwhelmingly, I think it's driving some pretty unintended outcomes, and trying to think our way really strategically through that to what can be done to make a difference without impacting on other third parties now is going to be the complexity in this, and that's the task in front of us as well as the ACCC and all the water ministers.
This must be doing your head in, because when you put it that way, it does my head in. One quick one. A lot of regional audience would be watching this tonight and saying, OK, give us a little bit of a time frame. When will you report to government? When can government actually act upon those recommendations? When are we looking at change again?
We're looking at providing our draft report to Minister Littleproud in early December this year, and our final report by March, April. What we want to do is give our findings and our initial recommendations to the Minister, then finish them off over the Christmas New Year period, then go back out to communities and say, look, this is what you've told us, these are our findings, this is our pulse check, if you like, of the regional communities in the basin, and here are our ideas about what can be done, and test that with the regional communities before we actually deliver the final report to the Minister in April next year. So preliminary work by December, final report by April. All right. Your
group are the hope of the side. There's been so much spoken about. We've got to find solutions. Good luck with that. And thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thanks for your interest, Chris. Good on you.